Every state of Australia has 12 senators to represent them in the federal parliament. We have the House of Representatives where government is formed. That's where you've got your Prime Minister and the opposition leader, and what you more often see on the news is particularly question time in the chamber with the green seats, where they yell and scream at each other and try and score political points. But there's another chamber to hold them to account, which is the Senate, the chamber with the red seats, and the design of that chamber is that every state has equal representation, so New South Wales gets 12 senators and little old Tasmania gets 12 senators as well. That was the design of the chamber, to make sure that no state overrode any other unnecessarily, so that when legislation was created in the Federation, there was an equal consideration for every state. Just as a little anecdote, as the ACT has 2 senators and so does the Northern Territory. So one of those senators that we spoke with on The Flow recently is Senator Alex Antic, one of South Australia's 12 senators. He is a Liberal. He won his Senate seat at the last federal election, and in some ways he's taken over the mantle of a regular guest we used to have on The Flow, Corey Bernardi, who was a former Liberal and then became an independent and later Australian Conservatives senator. It was a pleasure to speak with him on Flow. Here's what we discussed not long ago. Senator Antic, thanks for speaking with us on Flow.
Thanks, Rikki.
Recently, your government, you're in the Liberal Party, the government had a face-off with Facebook, and it looks like they won that face-off when it came to media stories and paying for those stories. But sounds like you've kept a watching brief on the social media giants like Facebook and Google. What have you been discovering?
Well, look, I have. I guess this is a bit of a labour of love from my point of view. I'm unashamedly a person who's, sort of a proponent of free speech. I mean, we know that freedom of speech has its limits, of course. Matters of, criminality do come into freedom of speech, and there are all sorts of other limits. But for the main, I think liberal democracies are best served when people do have that kind of run-up, the ability to be able to share ideas and talk to each other and communicate and report on matters of interest. So for the greater part, I think we've had that. News media has been heavily regulated with media ownership laws, and we've been able to do that, I think, because they are Australian-based. So jurisdictionally, we've had a lot of control over those. But in the last 15 to 10 years, that landscape has changed, and it's changed, I think, very subtly, but also very dramatically as well. And we're now seeing these big companies, and we talk about big tech, and often, it's said, well, what do we mean when we say big tech? It's sort of become a new handle. We're talking about companies that probably almost didn't exist 15, 20 years ago. Companies like Google, companies like Twitter, Facebook, these sorts of companies. Now, they do cross over spheres, of the technology industry. Google, for example, now, that was floated, I think, in the 2000 or 2001 or somewhere around there. It's a search engine, as we know, but it's now the biggest and most visited website anywhere in the world, followed up by YouTube, which is a content. So it's really a lot of people now. There are many people who talk anecdotally about never turning on their TV anymore, just using YouTube.
Yeah, and that's a subsidiary now of Google. Is that right?
That's right. So they, Google now is the holding company, if you like, of YouTube. And then you've got Twitter with its 1.3 billion registered users. It's a lot of people to be sort of sharing information around online, and then Facebook and Apple as well. These are massive companies now. When people talk about these, some of us are still, I think, stuck in the early 2000s with those movies like The Social Network, where we had a bunch of enthusiastic kids with dreams sitting around in beanbags playing ping pong, but it's not like that anymore. These are big, big companies with big, big ideas, and they shift policy at the blink of an eye now. We saw that, of course, with the US election last year, about how much influence some of these companies can actually have over the political narrative and over our lives. Yeah, well, they're almost the biggest influences.
And look at Twitter, for instance. They kicked President Trump off of Twitter, didn't they?
They did. Look, I think that's probably one of the most obvious and stark reminders of where we're up to now. So when you think about it, Twitter, with its 1.3 billion users, and I think something like 330 million per day use Twitter. It's a lot of people. It's sort of, the entire population of the US plus a bit, across the world, of course, removed a sitting president of the United States with his main, probably in those days, his main ability to communicate with people Now, they did so on the basis they said they had a whole heap of reasons, all sorts of things. But the truth is, at the same time they were doing that, we saw examples like we saw here, where the Chinese ambassador to Australia was posting photos, mocked up photos, I might say, of an Australian soldier, sort of slitting the throat of a child, Afghan child.
Yeah.
So the problem is really about, if big tech companies are the arbiters of free speech, then who's watching them? And that's my problem with the whole situation. I think we've drifted into this world where they've got so much control now, and we don't really know how they use that power and how they influence our democracy.
Yep. Does it become problematic for you as a Liberal when generally the Liberal side of politics would allow free enterprise to generally do as they please within the law, and then you've got something that's got to a size where it's got so much influence that government kind of can't ignore it?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I mean, it's often said, well, if you're a free marketeer type, then why don't you just let the market sort this out? I mean, if people don't like it, they'll get wind of it. We've seen an increased awareness, I think, now of some of the problems. I think people are much more awake to some of these things because of those examples we've just talked about. But in truth, I think one of the starkest reminders of why it is that the market can't always do it on its own, that is, was what the example we saw with Parler, which many of your listeners might remember. Parler was, and still is, but for the larger part was now, an alternative platform to Twitter, and it was pitched by some American entrepreneurs who said, look, we're sick of Twitter telling us, they're burying our news and telling us what we can say. So we're going to start our own platform. It's a pure market response in many respects. And around the time of the election, it picked up millions and millions and millions of followers, people that were pretty frustrated with the US president dropping off the scene and other such examples. But what actually ended up happening there was Apple removed Parler from its App Store in response to its increasing popularity, presumably, and Google removed it off the Play Store. And then you're left only with a website. Now, of course, the web is much harder to regulate, but it's also harder to access for people on their smartphones. So they were preparing to just use that sort of world. Gab is another one that does that, another platform, just uses a website.
So
but the issue then was that Amazon then removed the web hosting. So this cartel of big tech companies actually stepped on the process which would have allowed another alternative to show up. So we've got a problem with the cartel behaviour of some of these companies as well. We've got a problem with their censorship. And it's really beyond time, I think, that we started digging in and having a good solid look at it.
So as a senator in the legislature, there's perhaps some approaches that could be taken by the Australian government, you think, to, I guess, keep the playing field level if you support a market-based approach?
I think so. I think there's always a need for the slightest of regulation. When we see that, we just have to have regulation in some form. It can't be an open slather. The responses, they're all unique to the jurisdiction. It's part of the challenge because we're talking about Australian laws for US companies, Australian laws for European companies, whatever it might be. We've seen in other jurisdictions certain responses. There's been talk in the US. I'm sure many listeners have heard about Section 230 of the Decency Act, the Communication Decency Act, which is effectively gives these platforms an immunity to prosecution for defamation, and that's a specifically United States version. In Poland, for example, they've recently apparently legislated to criminalise these tech companies removing content that is correct. So anything that's real and can be proven, the sun
that isn't fake news,
rises and sets. Yeah, that's right. They get a penalty. Here, each response is unique to each jurisdiction. Now, my proposal last month, the month before, was for a Senate Select Committee to be set up to investigate these problems, investigate the issues surrounding big tech companies, what they do. And unfortunately, that didn't get the support of the crossbench in the Senate, and it went down. So we'll have to look to explore another way of doing that, because this is a big topic, it's massive, and it's really, really important to our democracy.
Yeah, and I guess there is precedent in the sense that the government, Australian government's been able to bring Google and Facebook to heel when it comes to tax, forcing them to pay tax in Australia, if I understand that correctly, and also the media example we talked about at the start of the interview about getting them to pay for news that they share in Australia. So at least there's a practical precedent, if you like, that you can regulate them to some extent.
I think that's right, and it does show that people are awakening, governments are awakening to the problem, and we saw it. Google threatened to pull out of Australia as a result of what was going on. They said, look, if you're going to make us pay for the content, we're just, first of all, not going to share it. If you remember that, there was only a month or so ago where you couldn't get any news. Of course, government sites weren't being shared on Facebook as well. So there was and I think that really almost belled the cat, if you like, about how powerful these. We've become really reliant really quickly on these platforms, and I think sometimes we forget how reliant we are now. I mean, just put your phone down for an hour and see how long it is before you need information. I mean, they're very, very powerful companies.
And in the context of that debate, one of your colleagues as a South Australian Senator, Senator Hanson-Young, and her Greens colleagues were talking about having a publicly funded search engine similar to the ABC in the sense that it was a public body, and that drew some interesting responses from some ABC journalists that they believe they already perform that kind of function. How do you respond to that idea of having a taxpayer-funded search engine equivalent to Google?
Well, look, I mean, there are a couple of observations about this. I think, frankly, every time government tries to do the job of private sector, it's very regularly an unmitigated disaster for various reasons. There's this old concept of Parkinson's law, which is, that public organisations like that create more work simply by having more people thrown at the task. Bureaucrats give bureaucrats jobs, that sort of stuff. So that's the first observation. I don't think this is an enterprise. I mean, government's good at some things. It's good at bits and pieces. It's not good at the work of private industry. I think that's pretty clear. This has been explored before. Germany, I think, tried it in the 90s, and it became very costly. I mean, these are huge corporations now that really do have a stranglehold on the search function, and they found that it was essentially too busy. And I think the Russians tried this in the mid sort of 2010, 2014. They had a search engine called Sputnik, which in the name of the old satellite. But that was looking at sort of billions of dollars. The ACCC, of course, are aware of these issues. There's some, as I've said, some competition issues that arise out of all of this, and they've estimated, I think, somewhere in the order between $10 and $30 billion to create this search engine. Now, it's a bit cute to say the ABC does this. The ABC does this with its own usual bent on life, of course, and it's sort of almost another example of the problem when you have selective news coming at you, and that's really what we're talking about here. But it's a bit cute. Look, I think there is always going to be a place for a public broadcaster. There's a whole other segment, Rikki, in whether or not that's being achieved by our ABC at the moment. We'll have to leave that for another day. But the truth actually is that it's not really seen the form of a search engine. I mean, I think the suggestion there from a few commentators was that they're constantly getting people ringing up and asking, what the weather is going to be, which is a search function, or what the frequency for 6RP8, whatever it is. Kind of yes, but kind of no. Look, this is the sort of thing I think that government needs to stay out of. I think we need to look more at the private businesses we've got at the moment and how they're operating rather than trying to reinvent the wheel.
Okay, Senator Antic, I have to leave it there, but thanks for your time. We'll come back to that topic of the ABC next time we chat.
Yeah, that's a whole other story, I think, Rikki. Thanks very much for having me.